Our class today is continuing in Yoreh Siman Pei Ches, chapter 88. We are talking about not to serve meat on the table where you're eating cheese, and vice versa, but that's not the title. And we are in Seif Beis. We are in the second halacha here. We started talking about not having them on the same table. We are about to learn about limiting that rule. The Shulchan Aruch says, when we previously stated that you cannot serve meat on the same table, Davka b'shnei b'nei Adam, hamakirin zetzeh. That was only when these are two people who have some familiarity. I know you, you know me, we like to eat together, okay? And that's even those people who are kind of stingy with each other. Don't touch my fries, right? Aval achsanayim, but people who happen to bump into each other while traveling and they share a table, that they don't know each other, those people can eat at the same table together. And another interesting rule, similar to those two guys, even if we're friendly, if we make some type of distinction, we'll call it a heker. Everyone has their own cloth or mat, okay, to eat upon. Right? So, or you have something in between, like bread, to let us know, don't touch my food. That works. The Ramah says, that's only we're talking about not eating that bread. So you can't just like share our bread. You can't like share from the parv stuff, because then the bread won't be a heker. It has to be a non-eating from bread. That is not. Why? Because the food's still on the table. We'll talk about what that means in a moment. Now, if you're sharing a pitcher, okay, and you're going to drink from it, that seems to be better because it's not normally there. Even if you are drinking from it. And if you put like a candelabra there in between you, okay, or any other thing onto the table to serve as a heker, as a demarcation point, don't touch my fries. Don't touch any of my food on my plate. But you, don't drink from the same cup. Why? Because the food sticks to the thing, right? You get the stuff on your hands, it's on the thing, and you're having a burger, and your hands are all greasy, and he's having pizza, and your pizza hands and your burger hands are going to meet on the cup. This is not good. And so too, we also, just to repeat ourselves, don't share the bread. And that's why we also have everyone have their own special container of salt when they eat on the same table. Because sometimes you dip in the salt directly. The nisharu shiurei meichel b'melach, and you leave yuckies in the right. You leave little yuckies over in the food. So we learned something new over here, that there is an extension on the rule that we learned previously about not having the food on the same table together, and also to like stay away, especially if you're a fleishig and they're having milchiks. So now we're going to talk about this din of two people who are staying at the same hotel. They don't know each other, and two people who know each other, and then you make some demarcation. What is this rule? Where does it come from? So it's actually a Mishnah in Chulin on Kuf Yud Zayin Beis 117b. Rabban Shimon Gamliel says, "Shnei achsnaim eichin al shulchan echad zeh basar v'zeh gvina vein chayshin." Right? He says this rule flat out. If we're two people and we're staying at the same hotel and we're eating meat and cheese at the same table, no concerns. Rashi says, what does it mean that we're not supposed to worry about you not eating together? Because you're not going to take one from the other. Okay? And the Ron echoes this as well. And he says that the enactment, the gezerah of putting food on the same table together, like when we had a fowl, like chicken meat and milk. So the problem is, you said earlier that you don't want to eat the cheese with meat. That we want to try to keep you from doing that. Okay, and so Rashi pointed out also earlier. We said that you don't want to have the food touch each other, because each one will touch. We're talking about things sticking and touching to each other. Okay? So there's two types of things over here where it seems, according to Rashi, that earlier touching each other is like the food itself, and over here we're talking about that you're going to take each other's food. Okay? So it seems to be each of the different problems. So the Gemara, it seems to be slightly different problems, but again, it's very similar to what the Ran is saying, and the Ran will be applicable when we talk about things like the cups in a moment. Now the Gemara explains, okay, the Gemara actually quotes the Mishnah earlier. Gemara says, Rav Chanan bar Ami says the name of Shmuel. Okay, we said Lo Shanu Elash Ein Makir and Zetza. So the reason when the Mishnah we quoted earlier said that you can't eat at the same table, we weren't talking about a case of where they don't recognize each other. Of a Makir and Zetza, Usr. That's where you can't eat together. Okay? Tanya Mihachi, Rav Shimon Gamliel Omer, Shleach Shalayim Shnis Archu Lefpundak Echad. Zeh bani mina tzafam v'zeh bani mina darim. Right? So two people who meet up at a motel. This one coming from the north with his meat, this one coming from the south with his cheese. Okay? They can sit on the same table. Okay? And they didn't prohibit this, even though they're sitting within arm's reach of each other. Okay? And the Gemara says, what does it mean 1 arm's length? Tisa achas. Okay? It has to be like, within a grabbing amount. So what does that mean? Even more so, he says makpidim zad. So the Gemara says, okay, so they're even within 1 shot of each other. What if we're 2 people who know each other but don't like each other? No, that doesn't count. Okay, he says that kol hasurikin asurin usrigi baisus mutarin. So the Gemara says that would be those things are prohibited. But the Surike Baisus are prohibited. So Rashi explains this. Rashi says, what does it mean that they come from different sides of the country? So therefore, they don't recognize each other. However, we said that to put meat and cheese on the same table is when they're only within Tfisa Achas. And so Rashi says that they have to be within 1 amount of leaning over. Okay? So, I could reach over to get it from you. So then he says, what is the Gemara asking about reaching over? It says, so maybe that was without a table. Okay? So that might be prohibited. But since they don't like each other or don't know each other, they wouldn't osir it. But for people who know each other, even when it's not the same table, that might still be a problem. How about people who don't like each other? So, that we say is going to be prohibited. Okay? And so, therefore, the Gemara comes out that with 2 people who don't recognize each other, it's fine. And they're not going to eat from each other. However, if 2 people know each other, they just don't like each other, we're still going to say that one may actually take food from the other. So, what about the 2 people who aren't really, they're not like family or anything like that? They recognize each other. So, what do the Rishonim say about this? Because it seems to imply from the Gemara that it should be usher. So the Torah quotes this Gemara that 2 people who visit a hotel together, they can share a table, and if they know each other, okay, or 2 people who don't like each other, that would still be prohibited. Okay, they have to put some type of distinction between each other. So either have to be arm's length away, or some type of distinction to keep them away from each other. And what do you put there? You put a cup, you put some bread, okay, and each person has to eat on their own separate tablecloth. That's what the Torah brings down. So Beis Yosef says, okay, where does he get this from? So that's clearly from our Gemara. So the Gemara's answer wasn't really answered, explains the Beis Yosef. And it's even though the Torah himself seems to imply that there's some type of familial familiarity, it doesn't matter. It's even 2 people who happen to be across from each other at traveling places, but they know each other, as opposed to strangers who are traveling and bump into each other. So that's what it seems to be in his statement as well, that you can't serve the food on the same table together when these are people who recognize each other, because people have a propensity to share. Okay? And so then you have to make sure that you prohibit it unless there's going to be some type of mark in between them. That's the Beis Yosef's opinion and explanation of the tour. So, and this is actually, oddly enough, this is not brought down here in Peiches. This is actually brought down in Orach Chaim, Siman Kufayin Gimel, where it talks about people sitting at a table together. So the Marashal has a different approach. He says that by two brothers, that's a reason, or people who are familiar with each other or their family, so that's when it's prohibited. However, if there are people who just recognize each other, but they don't have a familiarity, then that should be permitted. Because what we're saying is that when we're familiar with each other, we're just mad at each other, maybe we'll still share. But if not, there could be reason to be mutter. So he understands the question of the Gemara differently. So the Taz here in Peiches writes the following. So according to this Marshal, two people that know each other, okay, but they don't have a relationship, right? So if they're kind of picky about sharing the food, that would be enough. They don't need anything between each other. However, the Taz disagrees. And he says it doesn't matter, and that's not what the Gemara was talking about. It's because the rabbis didn't make an actual distinction in the original enactment itself. The thing was that they were excluding it for people who just had no idea who each other were and were definitely not going to come and touch someone else's food. But otherwise, we assume that every single case where you could take food, it should be prohibited. So the Taz disagrees with that Marashal and doesn't permit. The Shach says also that everyone disagrees with the Marashal, and so therefore, if you recognize each other, you should have to put something in between each other or eat off of separate tablecloths, separate trays. Pri Tovar says that this idea of people being picky about touching their food is only when they are saying that they're picky about him giving something back in return, okay? Or he's going to pay him back. Like, oh, you can have half my sandwich, but you're going to pay me back for a sandwich, okay? However, if you say, don't touch my fries, that he would agree with the Marshal in that case. And he disagrees with the Shach and the Taz, okay? And so he points out that, like we were talking about last time, when people take a vow not to benefit from something, that they couldn't eat at the same table, but as long as they know they're not going to share the food with them, that would be okay. So, does this also apply to non-Jews? Let's say a non-Jew comes to the kosher eatery area, right? And the whole place is kosher, like you're in Israel, everything's kosher there, right? So, and you don't know them, so what's the rule with that? So he says, so if it's kosher cheese in front of the non-Jewish person, and the Jewish person is eating meat, and they know each other, so that would be the same rule, even though it's not mentioned in the Gemara. Okay. However, if it's non-kosher food, what we learned earlier, then that would be obviously okay, because you're not going to share, even if you know each other. Okay? So you're not going to touch anything non-kosher food, and so that would be different. In the Sefer Hafla'ah, he says it's prohibited to eat with a non-Jew that you know, whether it's meat or dairy, even if you don't know each other. Okay? And it's only permitted by a Jewish person. Why? Because each person would remind each other. He adds another level of it. It's not just so much that we do or don't know each other, it's just we would remind each other, don't touch the food. Okay, but by a non-Jew who wouldn't be aware of not touching the food, that might be a problem. So that's his argument. Okay, so the Shach and the Shach disagrees with Hafla'ah and says not to be stringent on it, and in one of his very rare instances, the body of Shulchan agrees that you can be makel in this case. Okay, so if you're with a non-Jew, you can assume that you don't have to put something in between the two of you. Okay, so how do you get this heker, this distinguishing object, to work for you? Okay, so Tosfos asked that question first. He says, so if there's something that is intervening between the two of you, within one grasp, right? So you're within one arm's reach of it. So, we say that it has to be with that close. So if you're further than that, that would be okay. And our custom, says Tosfos, is that when you're eating meat and cheese at the same table, that we put bread or a can or something else in there, just like the Torah said earlier. Okay? Or just have a separate tablecloth or separate placemat. However, Tosfos brings that there are some people who only have a concern when it's within one arm's length and when they are actually very familiar with each other. So, for example, two people are sharing an esrog together, okay, and then the whole place they'd be really sharing the whole thing. Okay, so what does it mean to have it within one's grasp? Maybe it's just like has to be within the fact that we share the object, and how does it matter how far I have to go get it? We just agree to share the object. So in that case, she says when we're familiar with each other, then we have to make sure that we're eating on separate tables at all times. Okay, so tefisa achas means that I would be sitting close enough to you that I'm familiar with you. So I know people will be like, I'm not going to sit right next to you because I don't know you, but if I know you, I might sit right next to you. So that's the other possible explanation that Tosfos gives for that. Okay? So this seems to be that according to everybody Tosfos related, you could put something in between you to differentiate. So the Tur here says something very similar to what he says in Kuf, Ayin, Gimel, and Orach Chaim. So you can't put meat and cheese on the same table. And that's with two people who recognize each other. Okay? So, and that's even if you don't like each other. If you are two people who are visiting a hotel and you don't know each other, that's fine. And if you do know each other, as long as you put something to differentiate your space, that's fine as well. So the Beis Yosef brings down the Rashba, and the Rashba is writing this in his work, the Torah Sabayis, that two people who know each other, if they are going to go ahead and put something in between them, so like some type of food, okay, or some type of or a placemat, and they each one have their own, that would be fine, because the point is they might forget and start mixing their food together. And that would be the concern. And the Beis Yosef also brings down the Rif, and he points out that the Rif doesn't talk about this requirement of tfisa achas, of being within one arm's length. So he says that there's a separate understanding of the Gemara, which is that it's just like if I would be close enough to you whereby I would recognize you. It's like recognizing you and being close to you are the same thing, but being far enough away would be a problem. He also brings down this Rabbeinu Yerucham that says that the common custom that they're used to, and the Rashba also is the one who gives this as well, that you can eat with each other as long as you have something in between each other and not worried about how close you are sitting to each other. Now, what if you don't have something to distinguish your space, like everyone's sitting and eating on park benches or whatever, you know each other? Can you have somebody watch you? So Rikiv Eger asked this question, is that somebody watching, would that work or not? So he says he thinks not, because I would have to do it to you at all times without any type of break, and no one is going to pay attention the entire time, right? Someone's gonna inevitably look away. They're gonna start watching the birds, and they're gonna steal a fry, and the whole world will fall apart at that point. So therefore, you can't do that. So the Mishnah Berurah was asked about this question about, can I have somebody sit and watch me? So he talks about a case of where they used to light oil candles on Shabbos, and the concern was you shouldn't use them because you might tilt it to increase the flame. Can I have somebody sit there and watch me to do that? Okay, so if I need somebody to watch over you the entire time, that's no good. Okay, even with a good candle. Okay, so that seems to be very consistent, because no way someone could pay attention to you the entire time. And so it seems that the Mishnah Berurah would agree with this din of the Rebbe Kiva Eger as well. How about if you say that you're sitting super far away from each other? Now we mentioned that in the Gemara. Can we say that I sit far enough away where I can't just stay where I am and reach your food? I'd have to get up and go over there. So the Bach asks this question, and he brings down the Marashal, that if you are far enough away where I couldn't reach to your plate, that seems to be okay. And this is echoed also by the Knesset Gedolah, the Pri Megadan, Pri Toar, and they all quote the Bach. Okay? And everyone seems to say that that's fine, and this is also echoed in the Aruch HaShulchan and the Kaf HaChaim. The Badi Shulchan, he says that there is a reason to be concerned as whether or not sitting far enough away from another person without having some type of space in the middle. So since it seems to be that this Bach says that you don't need it as long as you're sitting far enough from away from each other, and he leaves it off with, I'm not sure. Madnei Shulchan says that it seems that according to the Maharam in Rottenburg, that it's only when people recognize each other, so where two people are not anywhere near each other, that's not considered a reason to have anything in between them. Okay? And so, if you're concerned about the Sefer Badei Shulchan, in the Sefer Zivchei Tzedek, he says you could use a shomer in that case, because he'll tell you, don't come over to this guy's table, don't come over to our section. Okay, so it seems like you could be lenient in that case. Okay, what if it's one person? Okay, so what is this question? We brought this Maharam Rottenberg over here. So what does Maharam Rottenberg say? So they bring down this question that a hecker works when you have two people, and you have two people who know what's going on. Okay? So that's when you state it that way. But a person sitting eating by himself, and he has something there, he puts a candelabra there. Can someone else then come and sit there with him? Okay? So that would work out fine. It also would work is if you're eating on one table and you're going to have cheese first and meat second. You could put the cheese here, put a hecker down, and go to another plate. Okay? So that's what the Chacham Sodom says. There are other people who come later and they seem to disagree with the Chacham Sodom. If it's only one person, it doesn't work because you're really trying to have somebody else help to remind you. Okay? So so some people seem to say that. But since it's a rabbinic halacha, you could rely on the Chacham Sodom because it's only rabbinic, and especially if you don't have a lot of space, there's no reason to be machmir in such a case, especially when it's not mentioned explicitly in the Talmud. Now, what if you have people in between you? So let's say like these two people are eating dairy, and then there's somebody with his back to him, sitting very close to each other. I guess you could reach over there. So there's actually a tshuva that's brought down to the Pischei Tshuva, and he's asked the question that if there are people sitting there at the table, can you use that person as your demarcation point, even without making it a demarcation point? Okay? And so it seems to imply that this is something else that you could learn from other cases where you're not allowed to sit and share a plate with somebody else as well. So some people are actually very lenient in this case, that as long as you're not sitting exactly the same table, it's like sitting at a distance, that would be fine. However, the Badei Shulchan, as is his custom, is macher in this case. Okay, so he disagrees with the Pischei Tshuva. He says you should be strict. But I'm just bringing that down, not because that's a halacha, but just so the Badei Shulchan once again takes the machmir stance. This is why I always recommend people should always own the Madnei Shulchan, because I feel the Madnei Shulchan is a much better halacha sefer. Anyone can go ahead and find the most machmir opinion anywhere, and that's usually when we're learning Yoreh Deah. The Badei Shulchan is full of every chumrah in the book. They should have renamed the sefer Chumrei HaShulchan. That would actually have been a more accurate name. Badei Shulchan sounds like you're going to carry it somewhere. I'm sure someone could figure out a reason why you couldn't carry this, so it should have been Chumrei HaShulchan. That's really been a better name for it. I'm going to write to the author and tell him he should rename it. Okay, so the Mechaber holds that we only have two people who don't recognize each other. You can eat at the same table without anything between you, and when they recognize each other, you have to have one, even if you don't like each other. So he paskins like the Tur and like Tosfos, that first opinion in Tosfos. So the Ramah brings down all these things that we mentioned, okay, that you can't eat from the bread, and that you can share a drinking pitcher, but you can't drink from the same pitcher. You shouldn't drink from it, get schmutz on it. So they take that approach, okay? So we mentioned that as the opinion of Tosfos, the opinion of the Rashba, and the Tur, okay? And it seems like the Rif and the Rambam were a little bit strict in this case, that hecker doesn't work as long as you're sitting within one reach of each other. So as we saw, we didn't bring it, but that's because we understand that whole idea of being within reach to be okay. So it's oddly enough, the Mechaber follows his other opinion, which is if it's a midrabanan, you are lenient. So he doesn't follow the majority opinion of the Rif and the Rambam in this case. Okay? So that's what we're basically saying over here. So the Pesach Shiva asks a similar question over here. He says, well, what if we know each other, but we've taken a vow not to benefit from each other? Okay? So he says that the shach seems to imply that the prohibition is when we're not embarrassed from taking food from each other. And so therefore, if I've taken a vow to not benefit from you, or for benefit from a certain type of food, like let's say you're eating regular milk and I'm eating Chalav Yisrael only, there's reason to say that you could not put on the table together because you might still eat from it by accident. Okay? So when we say they don't know each other, we mean that they're not familiar with each other. Okay, and then we say that the hecker will work out as well. Okay, so let's see. The shach says that if they're far enough apart from each other, that suffices without having to have a hecker in between them. Okay. Now, we also bring down that if you put the bread there, so the Pri Megadim asks the question. That the Ramah is right, that if you have the bread, even though the Beis Yosef is not lenient, he just didn't state it clearly that you aren't eating from it. Okay? And the Knesset Segula also adds that it can't be slices, it has to be a whole loaf or a roll. Okay? However, the Beis Lechem Yehuda writes down that any piece of bread, as long as you're eating it, is okay. Okay? So the Ramah, when he quotes this law, he's saying that it has to be some bread that they're not eating from, and they have other bread as well. That's actually the Ramah's differentiation between himself and the Mechaber. And so the Levush points this out as well, that you need, he adds, number one, you need a whole loaf and not a slice. And he also says that you have to have your own bread. Okay? Because no one's going to look at a piece of bread and go, oh yeah, it means I can't touch his plate. Okay? And other people agree with him as well with that explanation, like the Knesset Gedolah and Kaf HaChaim. Okay, the Pri Megadim disagrees and said everything can be a heker, and he disagrees with that understanding of the source the Ramah quotes again. Okay, so and he questions the logic of the stringency. Who says what kind of bread? No one mentions what kind of bread. That's you adding that stringency. Okay, now what about if we're sharing a pitcher? Okay, so the Sefer Yad Avraham says that one person is drinking from it and the other person is not drinking from it. But the Ramah seems to imply that they are both drinking from it. So he seems to feel that you're not both drinking from it. The Pri Megadim disagrees and he says no, they're sharing this drink container, but each one of them has their own smaller cup to pour into. So you crack open a Coke and you pour it into each other's cup, and that's okay. We also talked about putting in other things into there to make a mark, like putting a candelabra there or something like that. Okay, so it has to be something that's normally not there. So, for example, if you always have flowers on the table, putting the flowers in between you won't help. But if you don't normally have flowers on the table, you put flowers there, that'll work. The Knesset Gedolah says that you also should put any type of parv implement in between you, and not utensils that are either milchig or fleshig, because you're both having those opposite types. The Badei Shulchan says that we don't find any reason to anyone who's eating cheese can't have a meat utensil on the table, and so what does it make a difference over there? So he says that it's as long as you're putting it there just to be a demarcation line, that's fine as long as it's not normally on the table. Okay, so for once he actually has a kula for once. So the truth is that that's maybe what the Knesset Gedolah was saying, was that you might come to use it. So the Badei Shulchan is in essence agreeing with them. So you could learn it both ways. The Yad Yehuda and the Darchei Tshuva bring down that it can't be flat; it has to be raised up a little bit, and that's actually mentioned in the Taz, who's also quoting the Darchei Moshe, and the Darchei Moshe is quoting the Sefer Isser V'Heter. Okay. So if it's not a little bit raised up, it's a problem. The Chachmas Adam, however, says that if you put a plate in between you, that's okay, as long as you're not eating from it. Okay? Because why should it need to be different than putting each other on a tablecloth? Smart thought. Okay, and then the last thing that we talked about is that each one of you has to have your own salt container to dip into. So the Shach says that even if you're on two different tables, this actually is to say, this is a general rule, not having nothing to do with the Basar b'chalav sharing thing. This is sharing a salt container. So everyone should have their own separate salt container. Either cover it where you can't dip into it, or everyone gets their own separate salt for their meal. So that way you don't mix the food flavors. Okay, and in the Hagos Asheri, he says there was a custom of Rabbeinu Clonimus and Rabbeinu Yehuda that they didn't drink at the same table from the same cup. Okay, and this is what the Ramah brings down. There's not an explicit prohibition, he says, but they felt that was appropriate to make that distinction. The Bach says that it seems like there should be an actual prohibition. So he's disagreeing with that, because the fatty fat stuff, the grease fat from the pizza and the grease fat from your burger, they're going to mix on the outside of it. So he says that maybe people would actually wipe their face and their hands before they would touch the glass. So that's his answer to it. The Knesset Gedola says that if you are washing the utensil between each person washing, then that's fine. You could share the cup. Okay. And so he also mentioned at the end that if you're not using separate tablecloths, that would be okay when it comes to the bread issue. So when you have bread, so you have meat on your side and I have dairy, and but we have one loaf between us, so you could say that, hey, as long as I'm taking my slices and putting them over here, that would be okay, as long as your hands aren't dirty and touching the bread too. Okay, and so that's an interesting leniency of the Ramah he's bringing down. Okay, and when it comes to the salt, the Kaf HaChaim also says that you should be careful when you're cutting meat and cheese, that you should also make sure that you don't have the salt too far away, and especially if the salt was already being used for cheese or for meat, don't mix it with that bread. The Badei Shulchan says that this was then where they used to have an open container where they would dip into it, but now we go ahead and shake it on top, so it's not as big a deal. Okay, so what did we learn over here? We learned some really cool stuff. So we learned that you have to have that this whole prohibition of having stuff on the same table is only when you have two people who recognize each other, and if they do, you can put something in between yourselves so you can share the same table or have different tablecloths. So if you don't know each other, it's not a problem. However, you can't be sharing utensils, which has nothing to do with the din of the Gemara. These are separate rules where you shouldn't be sharing utensils. So some people say that as you shouldn't share the same cup that you're drinking from, and some people say you can drink from it as long as you each have your own individual cup. There also shouldn't be a utensil on the table that normally would be there. It has to be something that's not normally there, and you're not going to use it for both your meal or their meal. So if it's like a plate, you wouldn't be sharing it between each other. If it's the bread, you wouldn't be sharing the bread between each other. If it's the salt, you would be sharing the salt between each other. However, as long as you're going to keep your hands relatively clean, you could share a utensil that you're not going to be taking from mixing from it. So a salt shaker, for example, would be okay, as long as you keep your hands clean. Don't mix the schmutz on the outside of it. And pouring from the same cup, same thing, as long as you keep your hands clean, that should be okay. A shomer, someone sitting there and watch you to keep you from eating from each other, does not work. And if you're sitting far enough away from each other where you can't reach each other, that would be okay, according to many opinions. And except for the Badei Shulchan, but the Madin Shulchan said that was okay. And then there's a question of if you are trying to separate your food when you're by yourself. That seems to work, according to Zmaram and Rottenberg. It doesn't work. It only works if you have two people. Excuse me. And someone else will remind you. But if you just put something in between each other, having them on the same table wouldn't work. However, the Chacham Zan disagrees and is lenient in that case. Let's see. Having people in between you who are not eating meat or fish, or who are not eating meat or dairy, but are having, let's say, fish, something parv, might be okay to work as well if you don't have anything else to put in between you. And let's see, what else? And they also say that you should have separate utensils when you're dipping into them. All right, so that's what we learned. That's what we learned from this halacha. I will also put together another video to also kind of go over some of these laws, but that covers Seif Beis. We will pick up next week with Simon Pei Tess and go over some of the laws of waiting between meat and milk. Thank you for joining.